Well, good evening, students and leaders. I'm so grateful to be able to come to you guys again with another message. It was great to worship with you guys last Sunday all together in Simmons Hall, and wanted to invite you guys also this coming Wednesday. We're going to be at Lakeside Park doing a flag football tournament. So if you guys get a team together, start talking to your friends, shoot some texts out, and get a team together and come play flag football with us at Lakeside Park. You guys will hear more about the specifics on that through social media in the next few days. So the book of Daniel is kind of what we've been walking through the past few weeks. Last Sunday, we had a little bit of a break from Daniel, but we're jumping back into chapter 4 tonight. And so last week, or 2 weeks ago, Stephen talked with us about Daniel chapter 3, and Nebuchadnezzar builds this huge golden image that he commands all the people to worship to. And so Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, of course, don't worship the golden image, and so they get thrown into a burning fiery furnace, but they're not harmed, and God brings them out, and we see this act of faith by them, and we see really God's faithfulness to honor their obedience to Him by not bowing the knee and serving this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar has put up. And so tonight is Daniel chapter 4, and this chapter is really interesting because it's actually Nebuchadnezzar himself telling the story. We get the story from Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. He's the one narrating the story, telling us what happens here in the events of chapter 4. It's kind of him looking back on these events, telling the story from his memory. And it's really, really similar to what happened in Daniel chapter 2. You know, in Daniel chapter 2, if you guys remember, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this dream is causing a lot of anxiety and worry in him, and he's freaking out, and he can't understand the interpretation of the dream, and so he calls in the wise men, the magicians, the enchanters, all these people to come in to help him understand the interpretation of the dream. And as you guys remember, that none of them can do it. None of them can tell him what the dream is or what the interpretation is. And so Daniel runs in and tells him, hey, I can give you the interpretation of the dream. He goes back to his house, tells Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, hey guys, pray with me. I just told the king that I'll give him the interpretation of his dream tomorrow. I don't know the interpretation of the dream, so let's pray to God that He would provide it and would give it to me. And so God comes through in that chapter. And very similar to what happened in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar has another dream here in chapter 4, and it's causing him to be anxious and worried. And so he calls in the magicians and the enchanters again. It's the same story, but again, of course, they can't tell him the interpretation of the dream. And so he says, you know what, I'm going to call the one guy who I know can tell me the interpretation of this dream. And so he calls Daniel in, and he brings Daniel in, and Daniel says, okay, so tell me the dream and I'll tell you the interpretation. And so King Nebuchadnezzar tells him the dream. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of story tell the dream to you guys. What he says is as I was sleeping, I saw in an image of the night, in a vision, in a dream, there was this huge tree that stretched as high as heaven. And this tree stretched as high as heaven, and its branches were vast and spread out far and wide, and it was full of leaves, and there's abundant fruit on the tree. And the tree was so big that it provided shade for animals, and it really explains this tree as like a giver of life. Birds would come in and would make their nests in the tree and would benefit from the shade that it brought. Animals would come and they would lay under the tree and benefit from the tree's shade. They would eat the fruit of the tree. And so you really get this image, this picture that this tree is providing life to everyone and everything that it comes in contact with. And it's in the middle of the kingdom here. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, but then something different happened. I saw a holy one, kind of like this angel or something from heaven come down. And this angel declared, chop down this tree and cut off all of its branches. Get rid of its leaves and scatter its fruit. Cut it down and get rid of all of it. The birds will flee from it. The animals will run away. The fruit will be stripped away from it. Everything will be gone from it. But he says, but leave the stump of the tree in the ground. So chop it down, but just like you would take a chainsaw to a tree and there would be a stump in the ground, he said, leave that stump where it is in the ground. And then something changes, something different happens. And he begins referring to the stump as if it's a person. He says, let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his mind leave him, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And so you're starting to question and ask yourself, like, who is this stump? What is this stump? What's going on here? And so King Nebuchadnezzar tells the story to Daniel, and then he says, you know, this Holy One says this at the end of my dream. Here in chapter 17, in verse 17 of Daniel chapter 4, the angel finishes the dream by saying this: the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom He will and sets over it the lowliest of men. And then the dream ends. So the tree is chopped down, its stump remains in the ground. He says, let its mind leave him and let him take on the mind of a beast. And then he says, this is going to happen so that the kingdom of men may know that God is the one who reigns over the kingdom of men and sets over it the lowliest of men. And so it's to teach a lesson. And King Nebuchadnezzar looks at Daniel and he says, what's up with this dream? How do I understand this dream? How do I interpret it? And I want you guys to look at Daniel's response here in Daniel chapter 4 and in verse 19. Daniel says this. It says, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belteshazzar, that's Daniel, let not the dream or the interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you and its interpretation for your enemies. He's pretty much saying like, oh king, I don't want this dream to be about you. May this be for those who hate you. This isn't good. This isn't a good dream. This isn't good news. May it be for your enemies and for those who hate you. And what you notice here in these verses is that the same king who threw Daniel's best friends into the fire a chapter earlier is a king who Daniel has some sort of sense of affection and care for in his heart, because he hears this dream and he knows the interpretation of it, and he knows that it's about King Nebuchadnezzar. And this isn't good for King Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel says, oh, king, may this be about your enemies and for those who hate you. Daniel has a care and a love for the king, and that care and love for him makes him want what's best for the king. He doesn't want harm and ruin to come upon him. And as I was reading through these verses and reading through Daniel chapter 4 this past week, it made me think a lot about my boss in college. When I was in college, I worked for the intramural department, kind of the campus recreation department at the school that I went to. And my boss was just a few years older than me. He was a graduate student, so he was just recently out of college. And he played intramurals on teams with us. And he was a guy that I got along with really well. We had a whole lot in common. We both loved to go play basketball. Sometimes we'd even text each other and line up to where we'd go to the gym at the same time and we'd work out together. We had formed a pretty good friendship. And I loved working for the intramural department. It was a really laid-back environment. I mean, you're just reffing flag football and basketball and dodgeball. It's really not a whole lot to it. It's a lot of fun. And so I loved working there and enjoyed my job a lot. And I enjoyed the people that I worked with. But in the middle of the intramural fields, you had these kind of 4 fields around the central building. It was kind of like a shed. And we called the shed the crib. And so the crib was where you'd kind of go and hang out, where you'd get your ref shirt and put it on before going out to ref your game or whatever you were doing. And there'd be people hanging out in the crib all the time, coworkers and things like that. And me and a few of my friends that I was involved in college ministry with all worked together as refs, but there were also a whole lot of other people that worked there, and most of them weren't believers. And so the conversation that was going around in the crib most nights was whose house or whose apartment was the party going to be at that night, or when everybody got off work later, what bars were they going to that night to hang out. And so it wasn't, a place where God and the things of God were talked about and enjoyed. And so, we had to be kind of careful with that and maneuver those waters, with a lot of caution and care. And so it was this environment where people just loved to party and they were far from the Lord. But I want to make the point to you guys that recognizing that those coworkers and that my boss in particular lived a lifestyle that I didn't necessarily agree with wasn't something that pushed me away from them. It was something that pushed me and my friends to want to go and make an impact on their lives. We wanted them to know the hope of the gospel. Like I said, my boss is a guy who I got to be really good friends with. We would hang out. He would come over to my house with my roommates. We'd watch college football together on Saturdays. I loved him and had a genuine care and affection for him. And so I wanted him to know the hope that was within me. So it didn't push me away from him. It pushed me to him and to my other coworkers. But I will tell you guys that I had to maneuver and go through those waters with a lot of caution. It made it to where, I had to be careful of when and how I hung out with those people that I worked with. I wasn't going to go to the bars with them. I wasn't going to go to the parties with them there on those Thursday and Friday nights. But I had no problem inviting some of them over to my house to watch football with me and my roommates, or to go and hang out and get dinner before work or something like that. And thankfully, during my senior year, my boss texted me one night and just said, hey, you want to go and grab Chick-fil-A tonight before work? And I said, yeah, sure. I don't have anything else to do. And so we went and talked, and I'd been praying along the way, and my friends and I had been praying together for a few different coworkers that we worked with for God to open up a door for us to share the gospel with them. And that night at that conversation, I just was able to ask him some questions. What is your spiritual background like? Did you grow up in church? Did either of your parents grow up in church? Were you raised around faith or anything like that? And we got to have a really good, honest conversation. I was able to share the gospel with him that night. And he didn't repent and put his faith in Jesus that night, but I was really grateful that I got to sow a seed for the gospel, and I'm praying that God uses that in the future. And he actually texted me just this last week and was just, hey man, how are you doing? I haven't talked to you in a while. And we kind of got to catch up a little bit. And so I'm continuing to pray that God would stir up affection for himself in his heart, that God would use other other people and bring other people into his life to draw him to himself. And so hopefully that seed that I was able to plant that night at Chick-fil-A is something that the Lord will honor and the Lord will bring to fruition. But I had a genuine affection for my boss and love and care for him. And I wanted to do whatever I could to share the hope that I had and to let him know the gospel and for him to have a relationship with God and know him. So it pushed me to him, not away from him. And I think this is really similar to what was happening with Daniel and King Nebuchadnezzar. He had been serving King Nebuchadnezzar for years, and Daniel grew to love King Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, they had somewhat of a friendship. Daniel served as like an advisor to him. Even if he didn't agree with everything in his life, Daniel wanted to influence him and to be a light for the gospel in his life. And so he hears this dream, and he knows the interpretation of it, and he knows that things aren't going to go well soon for King Nebuchadnezzar. And so he says, "Oh, King, may this be for you and for your enemies, or for your enemies and for those who hate you." And then later on in verse 27, he's going to say, "Therefore, O King, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may be perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity." He says, like, "King, turn from your wicked ways and turn to righteousness." Unfortunately, maybe King Nebuchadnezzar did for a time, but what we learn in verses 28 through 30 is that 1 year later, this is what happens. It says all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. So all those things about the tree with the branches and it being cut down and his mind being taken away from him and him being given the mind of an animal, it says that he would be sent out into the wilderness on his hands and knees for 7 periods of time, eating grass like an ox. He lived like an animal. It said that his hands and his fingernails grew as long as claws, that his hair just got overly long, and he's just crawling around like a beast in a field in the wilderness. And it says all of these things came upon King Nebuchadnezzar, because at the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said this. He's looking out over his kingdom and he says, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" He's pretty much saying, like, look at everything that I've built. Look at how awesome it is. Look at how great this kingdom is. I've done this. I'm the man. Like, I'm awesome. Look what I've built. And it says that as the words were still in his mouth, God spoke to him from heaven and says this, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field." And everything that I was just explaining a moment ago about him eating grass like an ox and everything else happens to him, and his mind leaves him, and he's living like an insane person in the wilderness. And then listen to verses 34 and 37. It says this, "At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever." Going down to verse 37, it says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." Nebuchadnezzar goes through a brutal learning experience where his mind and his sanity are taken away from him, and he's stripped of everything. He's stripped of his kingdom, and he's stripped of his own mind and made to live like a beast in a field. But at the end of it, God has done all of it to reveal to King Nebuchadnezzar that he is just a man and that God is God. And we see the same King Nebuchadnezzar who took Daniel and Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego away from their homeland, oppressed the Israelites, took away their identity, gave them Babylonian names, and then eventually caused them and forced them to worship a golden image. And if they didn't worship this golden image, he would throw them into a fiery furnace and kill them. Now, just a few chapters later, is praising and worshiping the King of heaven. God turns an oppressor of God's people into a worshiper of God in these 4 chapters. And there's 3 points that I noticed as I read through these verses. And normally I would break them down and explain them more in depth to you guys and get to hash some of these things out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that part of it to you guys. I'm just going to tell you these 3 points. And what I want you guys to do in your groups is to talk about where you see these truths play out in Daniel chapter 4, how you see them play out in your own life, and what kind of implications do they have for the way you live and how they impact the way you live. So write these 3 things down. Number 1, God opposes the proud. Number 2, God uses the faithful. And number 3, God can change any heart. Number one, God opposes the proud. The whole purpose of this whole chapter and the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has is to show King Nebuchadnezzar and everyone else on earth that God has power to take kingdoms to whoever he will and give them to whoever he will. And just like Stephen said last week, God exalts the humble and he humbles those who exalt themselves. God opposes the proud. Secondly, God uses the faithful. God used Daniel's faithfulness over years of serving the king faithfully into an opportunity where Daniel got to speak life into the king and say, King, turn away from your wicked ways and turn to the true and living God. God uses the faithful. And number three, God can change any heart. As I said, God took an oppressor of God's people, King Nebuchadnezzar, and turned him into a worshiper of the one true God. So I'd love for you guys to write those things down and to be able to talk about those in your groups. So life group leaders, hopefully you guys get to facilitate some discussion and y'all can talk about that more in your groups. You guys have a great night and we'll see you next week.